They mocked her for adopting two orphan sisters, calling it the folly of a woman already half ruined. Rebecca Hale was 34 years old, a widow twice mocked by the town of Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1889, for marrying a cowboy nobody trusted, and then for refusing to believe the story everyone told about his disappearance. She had little left to her name but a leaning cabin, a milk cow, and the stubborn hope that kept her rising before dawn. And when the county orphan wagon rolled through with two sisters nobody wanted, Josephine, 11, and little May, 6, Rebecca took them in without a second thought, though half the town whispered she couldn't even feed herself, let alone two more mouths. What none of them knew was that the elder girl, quiet and watchful, carried inside her a truth about Rebecca's husband, why he rode out one spring morning and never came home, a truth that would one day silence every mocking voice in Larkspur Hollow. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Rebecca Hale. If you've ever been overlooked or loved someone the world gave up on too soon, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Rebecca had grown up the daughter of a circuit preacher, moving from one dusty congregation to the next, learning early that kindness cost nothing and was worth everything. Her mother taught her to stitch, to nurse fevers, to stretch a single hen into 3 meals, and to never let a stranger leave her porch hungry. It was this same open-handedness that drew Thomas Hale to her, a lean, soft-spoken cowboy with sun-creased eyes who rode fence lines for the Tar Ranch. He was not a wealthy man, nor an especially bold one, but he was honest in a country where honesty was rare currency. And when he asked Rebecca to marry him beneath a cottonwood tree outside Larkspur Hollow, she said yes without hesitation. They built a small life together, a one-room cabin, a garden Rebecca coaxed out of stubborn soil, evenings spent reading aloud by lamplight. Thomas often spoke of saving enough to buy a modest herd of his own, of one day giving Rebecca a real house with glass windows. She believed every word, because in 4 years of marriage, he had never once given her reason not to. Then came the fall. In the spring of 1885, Thomas rode out with 3 other hands to help drive cattle through Cutter's Pass, following a route the ranch had used for a decade. He kissed Rebecca goodbye at first light, promising to be back within the week. He never returned. The other 3 riders came back pale and tight-lipped, telling a story that shifted with each retelling. That Thomas had abandoned the drive partway through, that he'd been seen riding south alone, that he must have run off with money skimmed from the herd sale. The ranch owner, a hard, proud man named Elias Cordray, publicly branded Thomas a thief and a coward, and because Cordray held sway over half the town's livelihood, few dared question his version of events. Rebecca alone refused to believe it. She wrote letters. She asked every drifter who passed through. She waited at the window on nights when the wind sounded like hooves. But 4 years is a long silence, and slowly the town's sympathy curdled into scorn. They called her the woman who married a thief. They called her foolish for still setting a place at the table some evenings, still whispering his name into the dark. It was in this same season of quiet disgrace that the county orphan wagon stopped in Larkspur Hollow, carrying 2 sisters whose mother had died of fever on the trail west, their father unknown or unwilling. Josephine held little May's hand so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and something in the elder girl's watchful, guarded eyes struck Rebecca like a struck match in a dark room. She had no husband's wage, no family nearby, barely enough flour to see herself through winter, and yet she stepped forward before the wagon driver had even finished his announcement and said she would take them both. The women of the town clicked their tongues. Even the preacher's wife suggested, gently, that perhaps Rebecca ought to consider her own circumstances first. But Rebecca only answered that she had been given shelter once by strangers with little to spare, and she intended to pass that kindness forward, whatever it cost her. The first weeks were hard and quiet. May warmed to Rebecca quickly, following her from chore to chore like a small shadow, but Josephine kept a careful distance, answering questions in short, guarded sentences, watching the road more than she watched her new guardian. Rebecca noticed the girl often stood at the fence line near dusk, staring west toward Cutter's Pass, though she'd never once been told the story of Thomas. One evening, mending by lamplight, Rebecca finally asked Josephine gently what troubled her, and the girl's answer stopped her needle mid-stitch. Josephine said that before her mother died, they had traveled for a time with a lean, sun-worn man who called himself Tom, who spoke often of a wife named Rebecca waiting for him in a town with a creek shaped like a fishhook, and that this man had died defending their small traveling party from raiders near Cutter's Pass, giving his life so the wagon could escape, and had asked with his last breath that if they ever reached a town called Larkspur Hollow, someone tell his wife he had not run, that he had died trying to come home. Rebecca sat frozen, her hands trembling around the mending in her lap, hardly able to breathe past the swelling in her chest. For 4 years she had carried the accusation like a stone sewn into her ribs, and now, from the mouth of an 11-year-old girl she had taken in out of simple compassion, came the truth she had never stopped believing. Josephine, it turned out, had kept the secret out of fear that speaking it aloud might mean losing the only kindness she and May had found since their mother's death, fear that grown men wouldn't believe a child's word against a rancher as powerful as Elias Cordray. But now, seeing how fiercely and unconditionally Rebecca had opened her home and her heart, Josephine finally trusted her enough to let the truth out. Rebecca held both girls close that night, weeping not from grief but from a strange, fierce relief, understanding at last why heaven had guided that particular wagon to her door. Word of Josephine's account spread through Larkspur Hollow within days, and predictably, Elias Cordray moved swiftly to discredit it. He declared publicly that no one ought to build a man's reputation on the fanciful tale of an orphan child, and reminded the town that his version, backed by 3 grown men in his employ, had stood unchallenged for 4 years. Several townsfolk, dependent on Cordray's goodwill for their livelihoods, sided with him loudly, and Rebecca once again found herself the subject of pitying, scornful glances at the mercantile and the church social. But this time, Rebecca did not simply endure the scorn in silence. She rode 2 days to the territorial land office and, with the help of a sympathetic clerk who remembered Thomas fondly, obtained the original manifest from the cattle drive, a document Cordray had always claimed was lost. Comparing it carefully with Josephine's account of dates and the route the raiders had struck, Rebecca found the discrepancy she needed. The manifest showed the herd had arrived at its destination 2 days late, and showed exactly the number of cattle a raid would explain, not the number a runaway thief would have stolen. It was the kind of quiet, unglamorous evidence that wouldn't satisfy a courtroom drama, but it was enough to plant real doubt in careful minds. Rebecca brought the manifest and Josephine's testimony before the town council meeting that winter, standing before neighbors who had mocked her for months, her voice steady though her hands shook at her sides. She did not ask for pity. She asked only that the truth be weighed fairly, for her own sake and for the sake of 2 children who deserved to grow up in a town that valued honesty over convenient stories. One of the original 3 riders, a younger hand named Silas who had always seemed uneasy repeating Cordray's account, finally broke his silence that evening, admitting under the weight of the gathered room that Cordray had instructed them to say Thomas fled to protect the ranch's reputation after the raid revealed how poorly the drive had been guarded. The room fell utterly silent, and in that silence, for years of whispered judgment against Rebecca began, at last, to unravel. What followed was not vengeance, though Rebecca would have been forgiven for wanting it. Cordray's standing in Larkspur Hollow crumbled swiftly once the truth came out, his contracts quietly withdrawn, his name spoken thereafter with the same wary distance once reserved for Rebecca herself, a fitting, unforced justice that needed no hand from her to enact it. Rebecca, for her part, used the small settlement the ranch was compelled to pay in restitution not to enrich herself, but to help rebuild the schoolhouse roof that had been leaking for 3 winters, and to establish a modest relief fund for families passing through Larkspur Hollow with nowhere else to turn. A fund she named, simply, the Fishhook Creek Fund, after the little creek Thomas had once described to a grieving girl on a wagon trail hundreds of miles away. The same women who had once pitted Rebecca at the mercantile now brought pies to her door, not out of obligation, but out of genuine, humbled respect. And so we return to where we began, to a woman who had lost her husband, her reputation, and nearly her hope, and who found all 3 restored not through some object bought cheap and forgotten, but through an act of simple, unconditional kindness toward 2 children the world had already written off. Rebecca Hale understood, in the end, that the truth she had waited for years to hear had been carried to her door not by chance, but by the same compassion she had shown when she opened it. Josephine, no longer a guarded, watchful child, but a girl finally free of a secret too heavy for young shoulders, grew up in that little cabin with her sister May, and Larkspur Hollow slowly became a town that remembered Thomas Hale not as a thief, but as a man who died trying to come home to a wife who never stopped believing in him. Thank you for spending this time with Rebecca, Josephine, and May.